We'll just try and get through this track just to kind of, I mean, anyone can jump in at any point if you just got queries, because it's...
Yeah, I was going to ask what plugins you've got on your bass channel.
On that bass channel, yeah, I'll quickly go through that because there's a few important things there. There's a Fab Filter EQ. I kind of don't actually know what that's doing, but it's obviously a little similar thing to that drum. There's a little kind of resonant whistle, which with the distortion on, you won't hear it on the sub on its own, but as it's getting brought out, or possibly as the filter's coming up. I think the main lifting on this, this is holding it in quite nicely, which is just compressing, yeah. Which just sounds a little bit flappy and kind of loose without it. I'll stay around this bit because there's a bit more filter up there. And you can hear the way it kind of just glues the bass together in those wobbles. It's less kind of inconsistent. And what I'll do a lot of the time is just sit. As I get to that stage, I'll try about 5 different compressors, go through all my sort of favourite compressors and see which one suits that bass best, because this is a kind of warmer sort of compressor. You'll try another one that would, you know, sound too digital. Sometimes this one just might fart and start distorting for some reason. So a lot of it's just trial and error of different plugins, which one suits that sound. There's some heavy limiting on here, but it's not actually that heavy because it's coming in really quiet. So you can see the reduction is just slight on that.
What key is it in?
It's this is a good point. I mean, a lot of...
How low can it go?
Yeah, I mean, my rule of thumb is like E. E is as low as you want to go, and I've done loads of tunes in the past under that, and it's just drums in the club, and you just hear no bass, and it's really disappointing. So yeah, like really E, F, G are the main best, you know, and the sharps in between those, F sharp, G sharp. They're all good frequencies, which is roughly around sort of 40 odd hertz, like 44 hertz, I think is F. And yeah, once you just really get under 40 hertz, you're not really hearing much, which is another reason why the next plugin in this chain is a low cut at 40 hertz there. And it kind of sounds good without that, and it's really hard to put low cuts on because you're like, oh, I'm losing bass. A high pass or a low cut, yeah, it's the same thing. They call it a high pass on here, sometimes it's a low cut. But 40 does seem to roughly be a very good frequency to aim to. Maybe not to roll all the way up to 40. The reason I've used this Abbey Road one is it's quite like a shallow low cut where some of them are just really sharp. Having a sort of slopey one, you just don't lose everything. You still got some of that low stuff, but you'll hear with this, I don't know if you can on these speakers. It's hard to tell, but with, again, actually how I found out about this on that tune, this was the red light flashing. So the red light was flashing, I'm like, why is it just, you know, keeps peaking? And as soon as I put that 40 hertz cut on, it was just all this low bass under like 40 hertz that I couldn't even hear. That's what was setting off the speaker. And that will apply to clubs and anywhere really, or the radio even more. It's like all those low frequencies you can't really hear, or they're just rumbly. And so getting rid of them actually gives you more bass, weirdly, because it kind of gives you more bass above 40 hertz, which is what you're going to hear. And for years, I've not low cut enough when I should have done, and I've tried to just squeeze in loads of bass, and it does.
Give you more headroom as well.
And it'll give you instantly more headroom, that's what the speaker's reacting to, is having more headroom and therefore not peaking out, which applies to everything you're trying to do to get it louder, basically. Weirdly, sometimes putting on a low cut will create a peak, which will make it clip, because it's just sort of let a load of pressure off that bass and almost boosted up the tops. So sometimes you go around in these circles where it gets louder even though you cut it. But I'd recommend everyone to really low cut their bass to like 20 hertz just to be safe, even if you don't want to go up to 40, just low cutting the bass really makes a big difference. And still until about a year ago, like Bo Thomas, who's the mastering engineer that I use for everything, he said to me, you don't low cut enough, you need to low cut more. And it's just something it's taken me years to just, how much low cutting you've got to do, it's amazing. You'll see when I get to it, I've also got a low cut on the master channel as well. So this track's got a lot of low cutting on it, which I think I got obsessed with that week, trying to get it loud. And that's the thing, is like every week, every month, you'll get obsessed with a new thing. And it's like, oh, bass and low cutting, that's the thing now. Or it's like distortion and top end. And you just go through these phases of just like, that's what it's all about. And I guess you've got to do that for loads of years. You go through every phase till you sort of worked everything out. So yeah, what else is on there? Okay, this is another thing which, it wasn't this compressor, which I've had to switch it for this seminar because the previous one I was using the demo ran out. But it basically sounds more or less the same, and the principle's the same. You're basically sending, on this one I've got a sidechain, which is just a trigger basically of the drums. And that is bus 28 here. No, it isn't. It is bus 18. And so on the kick and snare, I've got them both going out to bus 18. And then what I've done here is turned off the output. So if it was on, you'd be doubling them up again, you'd hear the kick and snare again. But if you turn off the output, you get the signal, but you don't actually get any sound. So I'll just show you that so you can see it. So there's stuff going to that bus, but if you mute it, it doesn't make any difference. But now we've got that signal, and so I'm sending that signal into the compressor on the bass, which is this one here. And you will open up a lot of plugins. A lot of them won't have this little sidechain section, but if it does, then you can send anything to that plugin as a sort of sidechain trigger. And so bus 18 was that kick and snare channel. And you'll see as I play it, the kick and snare are madly compressing on that bass, and you can see that it's just pulling down only on those hits. And basically the main reason for doing this is that to stop the kick and bass sort of occupying the same space at the same time. And if I take this off, it'll probably sound a bit farty and flappy. It's not too bad. Because I've got auto gain on this actually regains the bass after it's been compressed, so it almost sounds louder around the points where the kick and snare aren't playing. And that's kind of how you get a pump sound, where the kick sort of squashes down, then it pumps back up. And a lot of that, you can sit for hours with this attack and release, getting a different pumping sound. In this case, I've gone for really fast, so it's literally just flicking down every time the bass drum and snare hit. It just flicks a little bit of level off the bass so that they're not clashing at the same time.
Are you doing that just with the low part of your bass, not the high?
Exactly, but you could do that with the high part of the bass, because it almost might be that the snare is kind of, blocking up the high grit of the bass. So you can apply this to anything, and I've done it with vocals and kind of, strings. You could have strings and vocals at the same time, and you're like, oh, the strings are blaring all over the vocal. So you could send your vocal to the strings and make sure the strings dip a little bit every time the vocal happens. So it's a great technique for sort of ducking things in and out when other things are happening. There's lots of guys I know that have sacked this off, and they're like, the problem you get with this is that it creates clicks and sometimes pops and farts where the compressor can't sort of react in time. So your other option is, if you want to do that, is you can go right in on the automation, and with volume you can draw out little scoops where the kick and snare happens. So you could draw out a little a little trough shape each time the kick and snare happens. But it just takes ages, and I'm a bit lazy to do that. And if you get it right with a sidechain, it will sound good. So yeah, that's kind of how the bass and drums are sort of sitting together without distortion. And again, that was something that was crucial to stop that red light flashing on the speakers, where there was just too much happening at the same time. And in the other tune that I'll show you in a few minutes, I've not sidechained anything, and you'll kind of see what happens if you don't sidechain things, but it's not always bad. And I'd say, and probably for like 8 or 9 years of releasing tunes, I didn't sidechain anything, and I was just not really into it, and was much more into EQing and using outboard gear to do that. But it seems to me when you're working in digital, you've got less kind of, what would be the word, kind of flat. Yeah, it is. It's like the desk, the actual using an analog desk just eats up a lot of these problems for you. and you kind of just don't need to do a lot of this technical compression as much when you're using like a mixing desk or outboard equipment, because it just sort of flatters things slightly better and kind of smooths it off for you.
So would you recommend running it all through an analog desk afterwards then?
You could do. I mean, if you ran the whole track just through the desk, you might just get a general warm sound on it, but it might sound quieter when you record it back afterwards, because it sort of analogs it up and you've lost all that digital loudness. And it would be like running a drum and bass track through a tape machine or something. It might sound great, but it will sound dull and quieter. So ideally, if you can mix it through the desk, for a long time I used a Mackie desk, which is a pretty standard mixing desk, and you got 16 channels, but I'd usually just use 4, and you've just got bass, drums, vocals, and sounds or something. And within that, it's just a different sound to mixing really. And what I'll show you with this other tune, Logic doesn't really handle loads of faders being loud together, I think. And actually in this tune, looking back at it now, I prefer to turn all of these faders down so that they're almost literally at like that height of full volume. Because the desk, like a lot of digital desks, once you put lots of things in loud, it just doesn't gel together well. Whereas an analog desk, you can just have it all in the red and it just doesn't really sound that bad. And that is a big selling point for analog. You can almost be sort of a bit more sort of slapdash or just a bit more raw and just go for it. Whereas on digital, you're going to like run into problems with just things sounding bad sooner. Which is why kind of, you know, since I've been working in Logic, mainly in the computer for a while, it's almost a lot harder work than running it on outboard, because you've really got to be on top of things. Just see where we got to. Sorry, a little bit louder, mate.
On that sidechain compressor, what attack and release times were you using?
On that one, it's literally like 0, or as quick as it can go. It's 50 milliseconds and 0.5 milliseconds on the attack. But quite a lot of the time, I'll have this sort of halfway up, maybe like 500 milliseconds. A good trick that I learned was if you, I don't have it online here, but there's a lot of little things on the internet where you can use the tempo of your tune to work out the milliseconds of like a delay of what that will be split into. And so I can't remember what it is actually for like 174, but there'll be certain numbers that if you work it out, that will be the correct release time for a quarter note or an eighth note within that tempo. Okay. And if you just look for, it's like a BPM calculator, I think is what the one I use is called online. And you just type in your tempo and it will give you all basically the release times that will actually be in time with the track. So you can notice it much more when you're doing like house music, for example, when you just got that solid kick at like, 120 BPM. I think it's around sort of 500, which is why a lot of compressors are roughly set to 500 milliseconds. And that will just give you this sort of do, do, do. And as the compressor releases back up, that's sort of in time with how often the kicks are pumping. So you can get that nice suck up and down. This is the problem with drum and bass, it's basically just too fast for compressors, and none of them can really handle like the speed that it's at. And a big problem you always get with a two-step beat is you've got do-cha, and so that second snare never has time to come back after that kick. And so if you're really long-winded, you can compress your beat, bounce it out, then take the snare that's got the good compression and exchange that for the badly compressed snare. And that's something I've done quite a lot, because you can't get the second snare to sound good with compression because it's too close to that kick. And I think that's why a lot of tech producers kept going with the middle kick, do-cha, 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 because then you've got more space for that second snare to sort of re-attack the compression. And that is one of the problems with that classic two-step beat, which is what this one's got. It's that second snare is too close to the kick for it to sort of react in time, which is probably why I've got these on the fastest speed, because it was the best way to sort of get it back in time to keep it punchy.
What sort of gain reduction are you looking at there? I can't see the screen's blurry.
The threshold is at minus 23, so it's kind of reducing. I mean, it looks like 18 dBs of gain. And like I said to you, this track is all totally extreme, and I probably wouldn't advise that. But you kind of got to do what you've got to do, and the number literally doesn't matter. And that's been my philosophy all the way. Just turn it up to full. It doesn't matter. The knob goes up that high, so why not turn it up there? So it is just literally how it sounds good. But as time goes on, I try and sort of do things less because you're it's probably a bit extreme, and I'm stitching myself up for somewhere later down the road by doing that. And this whole track more or less is a big stitch up. It somehow works in the end, and that's what a lot of my tunes are. You're just working away until it eventually sort of sounds good, and it is that hard for everyone from what I gather. No one just sort of makes a tune that sounds good really. So it is a big, so I'll get to the master, and that'll kind of explain a lot of these problems when you hear the track without the master.
Sorry, just quickly.
Yeah.
You said the old tunes you did on analog,
Yeah.
less hassle, sounded better. What made you change?
Well, basically, it was Logic stopped being made for PC, basically. So they finished Logic at Logic 5 on PC, and I stayed with that for another 2 years because I didn't want to move to Mac. But eventually, just all my tunes were just system overload. I couldn't get through one tune without it crashing, and it just got too much. So I had to get the Mac and then move to Logic 9, which I did a bit begrudgingly, and I've got used to it now. And it's better in a lot of ways, but and I do actually have my analog set up, and I've kind of gone in and out of using it recently, still trying to work out which is better, basically. And I thought maybe I'll be able to get it better with digital, and I've got so many more plugins than I'd have outboard equipment. I mean, a lot of my philosophy back then was to get it as good as you can in the computer with your plugins, and then once it's overloading and you can't put anything else on, put it out to the desk and try and get 10 or 20% more with the desk. And I used a DBX compressor, which is 100 quid. It's fantastic, and I'd recommend it to everyone. And literally, it sounds better than most plugins I've got now for just wicked drum compression. And even when I listen to my old tunes now, I'm just like, wow, that compressor's so good for 100 quid. And I've told about 10 mates to buy it, and everyone's got it because it is just, it's a DBX 266. If you want to write that down, but it's like they got them in lots of clubs. It's a pretty industry standard compressor. But you just won't get a plug-in to sound like that. And the good thing is, when you compress with that, you then come back into the desk and clip that sound with the desk gain. And that's a big sound of drum and bass, is clipping the desk, basically. And you can't really clip the desk in Logic properly.
So you're still doing that in some of the new tunes?
Some of them. I mean, with this album I'm working on, I really want to get as many of the best tunes done in analog. But the problem you do fall into, which a lot of people have, is this recall thing. So you've got all your faders set, and then you just knock one fader and you've lost the whole mix. Or if you want to work on 4 tunes at once and you're doing a remix and all of this stuff, for ages I just had one tune on the computer, or on the setup for a week, and you could only move on once you finish that tune, which is good because it forces you to finish a tune, but doesn't give you that option 2 months later, which is what happened with this tune, where I'd done that first version there, been playing it out in the clubs, and was like, no, it's not quite right. There's a few little tweaks. If I changed the desk, I would have lost this version, and you can't kind of carry on where you left off. So that is the big selling point of digital, is just, that recall and just being able to work on multiple songs, in the same week. And really, since I left doing that analog, my whole quest has been to try and, can you get that sound in a computer? And when I bought these UAD plugins, which are all kind of analog recreated plugins, this was the best hope to sort of get close to an analog sound in the computer, because they do sound very close to analog, and a lot of people say they sound the same. The big problem is it's the fact that you're mixing it in a computer, so it doesn't matter if this sounds exactly like an analog EQ, it's still in Logic. So that's kind of a big part of the problem. And I don't know what, I've never made drum and bass just fully without a computer, which would be interesting to see how that sounds if it was all like recorded live or all on tape. So everyone's sort of, stuck with the computer sound, which all the breaks you sample haven't been near a computer, which is why they sound good. So it's all a bit of a kind of round the houses. So yeah, I'll quickly just show you the master, and then we'll see how you kind of almost have to work back on your tune once you get to the master stage. And a lot of the time what I do is get quite a nice mix without anything on the master. You think it sounds pretty good, and then you flick on someone else's tune and you're like, wow, that's so loud. this is the sort of horrible, super loud level that we've all got to compete with. And now you've got to basically ruin your tune to get it really loud.
Charlie, would you be able to run us through the processing on the mid bass quickly?
On the mid bass?
Yeah.
It's pretty much what I said of just literally getting that sample, throwing it into the sampler. Is it this one? Sorry, it's hard to see up here. So yeah, I mean on this one again, I've got a little side chain just like that other. Oh no, actually that's switched off, so that's just compressing. I think that should be on, but because I've fiddled with this arrangement, that's come off, so that should have been on bus 18. So that again, that's just making sure that when that doesn't happen, it's so kind of 100 hertzy, that sound, it's exactly where the kick is. And that was probably the most likely thing to be kind of clashing with the kick and farting, basically. And there's really not much on here.
I meant more your FX sensor.
Right, yeah, no, I'll get to that. So yeah, the effects then, it's... So this is like a little plugin called Density, which is just a distortion plugin, which is kind of doing... So it's got a high pass filter on it, so you can just kind of distort it and then cut out the lows. Again, like I was saying with the compressor, I'll sit and try about 10 different distortions to see which one works best with that bass. Because they've all got different tones, and a lot of them have got 5 different tone buttons, and it's just literally sitting there trying to get that grit sound that you like. And then I just low cut that, and like I was saying before, actually this one's got a little bit of reverb as well. This is like a plate reverb, and that just gives it a bit of life and just a bit of space. It's quite well, it's not madly short. It's kind of average sort of length, 2 seconds. But what I've got here is you've got a dry and wet, so there's probably, it looks like about 20% EQ in the mix. Hard to spot it. But what this will create basically is stereo, so that then when I come to widen it, that reverb's created stereo on a mono bass that may have not even had any stereo. I'll see if that's the case just to quickly be sure. I think there's a bit of stereo on it already, but often if you've got no stereo on anything, which is another little thing I'll quickly show you on the snare, if you've got a mono sound, reverb will instantly give you a stereo field that you wouldn't have had before, and then you can use that reverb just to create stereo space. And that's kind of what that layer is doing, just that little touch of that sort of 20-30%. It's just giving a little bit of extra space to that mid, so that then when you widen it, it goes extra wide with the reverb.
Charlie?
Yes.
15 minutes on.
Okay, cool. 15 minutes, yeah? Wow. That's gone really quick. What I'm going to do then, I don't even know if we'll get to the second tune, but I'll quickly show you this master bus, because this is like a big thing that everyone's probably trying to do. This is the tune without it, and really the tune didn't sound like this when I started, but you've had to work back since you put it on, and it's going to sound rubbish. If it plays. So basically you can hear the snares really loud. And a technique that you do basically is almost over level up your snare, so that when you then come to limit everything at the end, the snare is going to be the thing that gets compressed the most. So you almost want to sort of overdo that. It's a weird kind of double negative, but it kind of, you'll see as you put these back on, the snare starts to sit in the track better. So that's making the main difference here. So what I'm doing with the Ozone 5 again is just basically mastering it as I'm going. You've just basically got a slight compression and limiting on each band, a little bit of extra stereo imaging, keeping the mids sort of slightly more mono. I think they got a little bit wide on the master. Touch of EQ just to sort of reshape the sound how you want it. And the problem basically is as you smash on all this limiting on the end to get it, I've got 2 more limiters after that. what a lot of people say, which is what I do, is using more than one limiter rather than just turning one limiter up loads. If you use two limiters and stagger the amount of gain you add to each of them, you can get a more sort of subtle boost without it just ragging it totally into the red.
Would you put the first higher or lower than the second one?
Sorry, speak up a bit, mate.
So would you put the first higher or lower than the second one?
I think, yeah, usually the first one higher, and in this case I've got quite a lot. I've got 5 on there, which you'll see is doing mad reduction. And the second one is just literally on 0.9, so it's just adding a tiny little edge, and often it's just the sound of the limiter that you basically want. Even if it's half a dB, it will just do a little thing. This Universal Audio one, just I always think sounds a little bit brighter and just adds a little bit of crispiness, which again might be hard to spot here, but all these things are little 5%, 2% sort of additions to the whole thing. What I thought I'd quickly, since we've run out of so much time, what I'd just jump to quickly.
Can I ask really quickly?
Yes, go for it.
You're hammering it, EQing it. Is that the version that goes out digital, or does it still go to both?
Right, that was the thing I was going to. So yeah, if it was cut to vinyl, I'd turn these limiters down afterwards and almost give them a level. You could turn it down here, but you want to just turn down the actual limiting. So I'd sort of give them something that was like, sort of like that, just held in, and then possibly even just turn down the output of the last limiter so that it's. So you've got some nice headroom like that for them to work with. And to be fair, for digital mastering, that's probably the best way to go as well. I give my guys sometimes fully maxed out things, and it's just like, look, there's nothing we can do to that. It's already just fully maxed out. So definitely for mastering, and really when you finish your tune, you're going to send it to mastering, always leave some headroom, because more likely they're going to have an £8,000 EQ that we don't have to make it slightly nicer. So I always leave something for the masterer to do, rather than just me trying to do it with plugins, which won't be as good. And I just written down a few little like top 5 problems basically that everyone will probably be getting, which I get on every track. So it was like flappy bass, just low cut and low gate all your sounds as much as possible. So for a long time, if your breakbeats have got all this sort of low noise and mush in it, that's all going to mush into your bass. So you want to kind of clean up your low end on everything as much as possible with gating and sort of EQ to basically shorten anything that's long and kind of bassy. And that, when it's combined with the bass, will just all be tighter basically. And another trick that I learned from someone else you can do if you've got a subwoofer or even on normal speakers, just roll off all of the treble on your track right on the end master. You can just use an EQ, so you're just listening to bass. And then when you hear that bass on its own, it's often much clearer what's going wrong there. Whereas when you've got all the treble and everything else playing, it's hard to really pick out in the bass what's happening. So if you just take all the treble off your track and just hear it really muffled, often you can actually hear why it's muffled and sort of flappy. The pokey mids is what I showed you earlier, where you've got these hard, sort of harsh, spiky things, which kind of applies to mids and tops, is just to use something like a dynamic EQ or a de-esser, which I use often on drums. I'll quickly load up this other tune in the last 5 minutes just to show you something that's not all smashed out. And mainly the whole objective is really just smoothing things before you boost them, so that you've got a smoother transient to boost. If it's all spiky, you're just going to be boosting spikes and harsh level that you don't really want. So this track is really simple. There's nothing on the master. I've just got one tape plugin and a limiter just doing like 1 dB, and you'll still get almost, I think, a nicer sound when you don't smash everything. So again, these days, this is what I'm trying to look for, is much lower levels on the faders. And this drum channel here is the loudest fader, and that's because I haven't even limited the drums on this one, just to keep the transients actually a bit punchy and let the limiter on the end do a bit of that work. If you totally squash all your drums out like Steam Train, you just get a squashed drum sound, which is good for super loud, but for sort of feeling an actual punch like a real drum kit, you're going to sort of lose all of that. So a few of the guys that I work with, we're all really trying to sort of go less loud, because every time really when it comes to it, it's just a case of turning it up 2 notches. It sounds better than the really smashed one that's 2 notches louder when you play it, you know, A/B it off the bat. And that I would recommend that to more people. If you get it sounding good quieter, a good masterer will just get that level you need afterwards anyway. And literally that's how many plugins. All of these are empty, by the way, on here. So literally, like, I've got about 12 plugins on this whole tune. And a big part of this, which I'll show you, which is the flappiness in a beat. I'll quickly just, if we've got a few minutes, just to show you what I do to a break beat to get that sounding good. This is just a full beat on its own, the Soul Pride beat, which everyone will know. So this is doing a lot of it, this dynamics here. So it's all that roomy reverb, the echoey sort of gaps between the hits, going in with each frequency, and I'm just using the gate section here to reduce that noise, basically, in between the loud hits. So you can see as it's hitting, that's all this noise we don't really want particularly.
Is that a transient paper?
It's a multi-band gate. And so you're literally just gating out, and you could do it, you don't even need to do it multi-band, just a gate on its own is really good, just to sort of basically chop up your beat more and make it more choppy and sort of, gated sounding.
Play all the drums, like all the different elements of the drum kit.
Say again, mate?
Play the other elements of the drum kit as well. Right?
Yeah, I mean, with this one again, I've actually laid just a kick underneath that. But trying to layer that kick without cleaning it up first, you're going to have that kick blurring in with all this low stuff we don't want here, and it just won't sound as good. Unless you're going for like a nice reverby live sound. So it's all subjective of what you're trying to get. But in this tune, I was like, I want to use that Soul Pride beat and make it sound really sort of fresh and modern and not old and kind of, you know, boomy. And another good little tip here that is something I do quite often, where you've got a dull old breakbeat, which a lot of them sound dull, using multi-band exciter, you can just distort the top end rather than EQing it. Because again, if you try and EQ something, you're just going to bring out the transients, which might be spiky in the top end, whereas with this, it's actually saturating them on a tape setting, which will smooth off the transients, and then you can get more treble in it without it hurting your ear, basically. I'll just quickly show you that coming on and off to see the difference. So that's just giving you that crisp edge that you want without it sort of just getting all kind of spiky and snappy. And I just added a little bit of compression just to give it some character, basically. Hardly doing much, but 5% difference. So yeah, I'll quickly finish off this top 5 little problems. So, you know, the blary issue that a lot of people might get, where it all just sounds blary, and you're like, why is everything so blary? It's usually, in my experience, all the faders being too loud, or things on the channels being limited and maxed out too much. So it is just like go through each thing and turn down what seems to be too loud. And if not, turn all your faders down and then just mix the bass and drums first. And you start unmuting some of your sounds and you just instantly be like, wow, that string's really loud, and you just pull it down, and that's all the stuff that's adding to the blariness. Which applies to vocals as well, any lead sound. Like with that lead I was showing you earlier, if it's mushed in with all the mono too much, or all the mid-range of other sounds are all going on top of it, you need to carve some space out for your lead or your vocal to sit in the mix. So I'm either doing that by panning things out wider so that the mono vocal or the mono lead can be big and solid in the middle with other things around it, or actually sort of side chaining or EQing it just so that other things, you can do it with automation as well, so that you actually, your levels change as the whole track goes through, which is a really big thing that I do, so that not everything's just the same volume all the way through. You're actually letting certain sounds in and out with volume So fading one out to let another one up, and then fading another one down, and you just get things coming in and out, and it's not all just flat sound all the way across. And what was the last little thing I was going to check through here? Yeah, like pokey mids is another thing that with the guys I work with, that's something we're always struggling with. And a lot of the time that happens once you've sidechained your kick to the bass, for example, the kick starts to get more pokey because of the fact that the bass is dipping and the compressor's almost adding a little transient sometimes to the front of it. So a lot of, I've been using these days is either the Wave C6, which is just great for, which is this multi-band thing, which again, you can just affect one little area without affecting everything else. And rather than EQing it, you can just tame back. So if I show you on this beat very quickly. This is the C4 actually, but for example, if we felt that the high mids were too spiky, we can just take the attack down so that it's hitting the compression really quickly and no harsh transients are getting through. And you hear, the more you do it, the more softened that little area gets. But if you do it too much, it sounds scooped and weird. And so this is the real balance to try and have things sounding smooth without sounding sucked. And that's really what I'm spending a lot of time working on. So obviously that's too much, but you can just sit away and tweak till you've got the little knocky thing or the little spiky thing just toned back. So yeah, those are kind of like common problems that always seem to happen on most tunes for me. And really low cutting and keeping your faders down, you're like halfway there pretty much.
I've got a question with
yes,
your
mate.
faders down. Is it a lower resolution, having your fader close to the bottom? A guy's not using a gain insert first and having the fader up at unity and using the gain to control the level. Is there a resolution where the fader is?
Do you mean like visual resolution or?
Is the resolution
of the actual, like, you mean visually on the graphics, the resolution or the kind of?
The actual numbers.
Oh right,
the code
yeah.
Sort of thing. I think it's a higher resolution at unity.
Right.
And having a gain insert first and
right.
The fader up at unity, all of them.
That could be true. I'll give that a go. I don't know. I mean, all I know is any tune I've turned the faders down with that were too loud, it always sounds better. So that's my sort of 2 pence on that one, really. But again, in digital, there's no noise, so you don't have to have all your levels high to keep the noise level down because there's no noise. So it should sound exactly the same at -10 on the fader or sort of -10 on a gain plugin. But what I will say that you may be right in, which is a big thing, is that using, for example, the Logic gainer, I'd highly advise not to do, to turn things down with, because this instantly changes the sound when you put it on anything. And other gain plugins do that too. So that's more what I'd be watching out for, is just what are you turning things down with? Because I've totally tried to avoid this gain plugin now, because it does cheapen it.
Is it alright just put
in mono? Absolutely, yeah. And a lot of sounds I'll load up, which that gain plugin is good for doing, just to convert it to mono. But I use the Waves one now, basically, to anything you want to mono. You use this imager and just pull that width down so that it instantly goes into the middle like that. And again, if you wanted to, you could use this gain to turn the volume down. And that, I think this sounds better than the Logic one. Some people will be like, I can't hear a difference, you're just moaning about nothing. But it does make a tiny 1% difference. And sometimes I use the fab filter just to turn things down, because that's quite transparent when you're not actually putting anything through it. Any last questions before we run out of time?
So what's the one thing that you know about?
I'll come to you next.
Sorry, what's the one thing you know about production now that you wish you knew when you started out?
So much. If it was the one thing, I think recently, like I was saying to some guys outside, just preparation is a massive key. And the more I prepare, the better the tunes are. So that's what I do sampling, like write ideas down, sort of just even if it's like notes of a premise of what you want to do, but any kind of preparation you just go in way more confident and way more kind of certain of what you're going to get out of it. So that's a big, and that's something I've improved in that I used to be a lot worse at.
Johnny?
Yes.
With time.
With time.
With time.
Okay, thanks everyone. Sorry it was so short.